Hi, welcome to Nap Time Nutrition. I'm Yaffi Lvova, registered dietitian nutritionist with Baby Bloom Nutrition and Toddler Test Kitchen. And with me today is the fabulous Tamar Rothenberg, also a dietitian and also a teacher at, where do you teach?
Oh, I teach at Toro College.
Okay, and so your main focus of your practice is on oncology and helping women to come to grips with their nutrition during and after a cancer journey. And I know we're both non-diet dietitians, which is great. And today we're talking about what can I trust, who can I trust, and studies and headlines and all that. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's such an honor. And I really appreciate being in your living room.
Really, you're on the kitchen table, but
okay. Well, even better for a dietitian.
I've got my tea and my breakfast right here. Okay, so
I just want to clarify that I work with cancer survivors. So usually someone after treatment, and my groups are for getting stronger after treatment. We have an ongoing research study on that particular subject right now, so it's very exciting to be able to see it in action.
Yeah, well, I've been following your posts, and we're in communication as well offline, and well, rather online in a different format anyway. And you put up a lot about current studies and how they're interpreted, and fighting back against bad science, or not so much bad science, but bad portrayal of science.
Right, exactly. Really misinterpretation of the data. And we see that a lot. We see that in the anti-vaccine community with horrendous results. But we see that in the cancer, I call them thrivers. They're not just survivors, they're really thrivers. In the thriver community, we see that because they end up either cutting out foods or fearing foods. And it does have an effect on your mental health as well, not just your physical health. So I do try to present the data in a fair way where you can look for it yourself, decide for yourself. And certainly if you want to take on something that maybe doesn't have as much evidence, if it doesn't cause harm and it makes you feel better, I'm all for it. There's no problem with that. It depends what it is really.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think it took me a little bit of time to mellow before I really called people out on things that were maybe not scientific based, but also not harmful. So I think it's important to let people have their journey as long as they're not harming themselves. So it's a really good point you bring up.
Yeah, exactly. And especially after cancer, you do want to feel some sort of control over your decisions, because cancer is really chaos. It's a lack of control. So if that lends you a little power, that's great. I'm all for it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because nutrition and using nutrition to care for yourself is so much more than the actual food that you're putting in your mouth. It's the power that it gives you sometimes. And when you've been through a journey like that, where you don't have control of your body, and that must be really powerful to feel that you have some amount of say in what's going on with your body.
Right. And also what we find among thrivers is that there are some foods they just don't want to eat anymore after chemo. They have a terrible association with it. And we do actually advise them not to eat their favorite foods during chemo. But what about after, when you're gonna? So we want to explore new foods. We want to go the other route. We want to add in more foods instead of eliminating foods. So you do feel that comfort level as well.
Yeah, and there's a whole lot of fear mongering out there with sensationalized headlines. So I want to start with this slide from John Oliver that we discussed, and I know you were familiar with this actual study, but the slide shows that everything we eat both causes and cures cancer.
Yes, and it's absolutely true. And there's nothing you could do about it. So live your life.
Right.
Yeah, really. Diet. When we talk about diet and nutrition, we're talking about not necessarily preventing cancer, because we really can't say that. But we can say reducing the rate. We can say making maybe an environment more hostile to cancer growth. But in essence, nutrition is about getting stronger, with being able to withstand treatment, increasing, maybe fighting fatigue. These are things that it works for. But we're not talking about, preventing cancer, except for smoking, which we know is a behavior that is linked to almost every cancer. But nutrition by itself is a great tool in our toolbox, but it's not everything. It's not a cure, that kind of thing.
Right. And what we're finding these days is that nutrition is is supposed to be the cure for everything. And for instance, the blue zones, the study with the blue zones, and there are so many factors. And just to clarify, the blue zones are areas in the world where there's a larger than average number of people living over the age of 100. And there are so many factors contributing to these people's lives, but somehow the nutrition has been isolated and we should copy the nutrition. But there is an enormous benefit to the social structures that these communities have created.
Right. That's a great point, because I happen to love that study. Sorry to interrupt. I get very excited about the blue zones. We do have even a blue zone in the US. We have one that's in Loma Linda. But if you look at their lifestyle, nutrition is one part of it. They don't smoke, they don't drink, they have very family-oriented lives. Their social values are very strong, their social connections. These are all things that help, exactly what you say.
And that's a very faithful community as well. Right. So they have not only part of their social structure is based on their religion, but there are just so many factors to look at. And when we isolate nutrition as the reason they're living past 100, we really miss out on the bigger picture.
Right, exactly. And it's true that most of them are vegetarians, but is that the reason? We don't have, we have some good associations. I wouldn't say we have clear-cut evidence about that, even though I do promote plant-based foods for sure. But there's no clear evidence that being vegetarian versus having small amounts of animal-based protein makes a huge difference. And we're still sorting that out. And yes, I do recommend more of a Mediterranean type eating pattern for people, which includes lots of colorful fruits and vegetables. There's no question. So I just want to clarify that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of us are on that page where we're moderate. We like to promote a lot of plants in the diet. We like to promote a lot of variety within those plants, different colors. I mean, if you have a lot of plants in your diet, but it's all broccoli, that's also not going to be something that's a positive. We need to have variety with color and texture and different flavor profiles. But yeah, the Mediterranean eating into actual studies. We were talking about, I want to pull up the original study first. So this original study that you had sent me, hang on, technical issues here.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. So this study, I'll take down the headline. Breast cancer risk after recent childbirth, a pooled analysis of 15 prospective studies. Okay, so tell us a little bit about this, and then we'll get into how it may or may not have been distorted by the media.
Right, or just snipped off. Certainly, were left out. So this is actually, there's great information in the study. It's a interesting study. Now it has, when you talk about it being in the media, so breast cancer is a very scary word to many people, of course. Women are terrified of it. And, when you get a diagnosis of breast cancer, it takes 30 seconds for someone to tell you that, and your whole life is changed after that. So we know this is scary. But so if we look at this study, they did what's called a pooled analysis. Do you want me to go into what the study actually did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, let's briefly talk about that. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about study design, so might as well.
Okay. So they took data from doctors' offices and then decided, if someone gave birth and at what age, was it protective or did it raise the risk of breast cancer? And, great information. It's a great starting point, but we can't say there's cause and effect because this wasn't a clinical trial, which would be unethical anyway. You wouldn't take two groups of women and say, you give birth, you don't, right? So right. We have to use what we have, and they used data from doctors' offices, which is very relevant. And they decided that what they saw from the data was there was an increase, a small increase, and it lasted a short term, though in our lifetime that would be a long term, that it lasted 20 years. But after the 20 years, it became protective, which is what we knew beforehand. We knew that giving birth was protective. We knew that breastfeeding was protective. So if you actually look at the study and what it means, we have to decide, is it relevant to us? Is it relevant to me? Yes, there's a population relevance, but really to me, what does it mean? It really means a couple of more cases a year of breast cancer over 20 years. So, not a huge increase, but it's something to examine further. And then, but if we look at it in context, right, breastfeeding gives you lowers your risk of breast cancer almost 50%, I think. I have to look at the statistics again, but it's incredibly protective. And to give birth at a younger age is very protective as well. So in context, yes, there's a slight increase, but most breast cancers start after age 62. That's the median, meaning 50% it happens before, 50% you're diagnosed after the age of 62. So exactly when you'll be diagnosed, possibly, is when the protectiveness kicks in if you give birth at a younger age. So that's put in context. Let's look at it, the relevance to us.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at how the media actually portrayed this. So we have medical news today saying childbirth may increase risk of breast cancer. Well, that's a little scary.
It's very scary, and part of that is true, but it's like, to me, it's like looking at a trailer of a movie, right? You don't know what the whole movie is. You don't know if it's relevant to you. You don't know if it's a good movie.
You don't know if there's a plot twist.
You don't know if there's a plot. You don't know what the end, what happened at the end. So this is a very small snippet of the data, which is, again, not cause and effect. So that's an important point. And then the second one, study finds higher risk. Yes, it's true, but I'd like you to also tell me that after 20 years, I'm even more protective because I gave birth. So that's an important point.
Right. So this is not the whole picture. It's meant to be sensational so that you click on it. But then even when you click on it, the full text of the article doesn't necessarily give an idea of the full implications of the study and the context of the study and how it's applicable, or if it's applicable to your life.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's see. This slide is when it's actually reported in a more responsible fashion. So we have here breast cancer risk, and this was the New York Times, which sometimes comes under fire for the previous slide and taking things out of context. So it's also interesting to note that within the same publication, sometimes things are reported more responsibly and sometimes more sensationalized.
Well,
so this one, go ahead.
Sell newspapers, yes.
Exactly. Breast cancer risk may rise after childbirth, but is still low.
So this is really nice. I mean, there's a real art to headline writing, right? And, and this is great. It puts it in context. It's not as scary, and has a nice picture too accompanying it, which is a joyful moment. So this context is very nice, and it works. And the article is very good too, because it does delve into the data and the fact that it's not cause and effect, and the median age when diagnosis may occur. So really, this works well.
Yeah. Okay. So then, as the public, as we are getting information from various sources, and I'm just going to say this: please don't get your news from other people's posts on Facebook, and that's also rashes, posting rashes on Facebook. Anyway, that's a whole other topic. Okay, so Dr. Google and Dr. Facebook, these are not good things to focus your energy on. So let's talk about what we should be on the lookout for when we're looking at a study, because ideally what happens when we see some kind of research is, as the consumer, as the person who is potentially affected by this information, we need to go into it and see really what's going on. So these were clues that you sent me as far as what we should look for. So why don't you kind of take this slide and tell me about these points?
So I often say that Dr. Google doesn't even have a nutrition degree. So, but I do, when I explain to people where to find good data, there are some definitely good sources on the internet but you have to really know where to go. So there's, a lot of people don't want to read the study, maybe there's not even a link in the article to the study, so you wouldn't be able to find it as easily. So I think it's more helpful to look for what are red flags that you're seeing on the internet or anything to do with nutrition misinformation. Anything that denotes a cure is probably false. We don't, I mean, when it comes to nutrition, we know that things are preventative, that you can prevent certain chronic diseases, but not cure. And certainly there's no cancer cure. And when I see those headlines, a lot of those people have been arrested already, so that's good. But
well, it's really unfortunate because it gives false hope to those who are currently struggling through that journey.
Yeah, of course. You're dealing with a vulnerable population. And again, they want to take their power back for good reason. So a cure is very attractive. But, immediately your eyes should gloss over when you see that word. There was, unfortunately, I think within the last year, an article that talked about that from I think it was a startup. And they were called out all over by experts about how that was wrong to say that. And it turned out they were looking for funding for their startup. So they used that word. So another clue is if other experts are talking against it, are refuting that, that's a good reason to stay away from those articles.
Right. I have a friend who's into research at Arizona State. Yay, Sun Devils. So she released a study recently, and she's the voice of reason. She's the first one who will tell you that the results that she found are preliminary. It's a small study. And this is how studies start. And we knock these studies saying that they're small, but the truth is that you start with small studies and then you replicate them on a larger scale when you can secure funding. And then when those can be replicated and replicated by other research teams, that's when we really take that information. But what happened is that these headlines got a hold of her research. There was a press release and it went crazy, and it was reported and has been circulated that now Arizona State has found a cure for a specific condition. And she, as the researcher, keeps saying, it's not a cure. We need to do more research. And the power is being taken away from her by the media. So she's not even able to represent her own research because it has spun out. And so I think it's very important to bring up that whole cure thing, that it's not even necessarily what the scientists themselves are reporting.
No, it's very unfortunate. And a lot of the media, they work very hard getting the information. There's a limited amount of time you can report something. So there are press releases that are sent from universities or other offices promoting their research. And, maybe the newspaper is not really looking at the whole study. They're looking at just the press release, which is obviously they want a good result. They want to show the results that stand out, but it may not be, again, the whole story. So it's hard to discern when you see studies in the media. And that's very important for that researcher that happened.
Yeah, well, it's a constant battle. Thankfully, other institutions, other places of higher learning are recognizing what's going on. And so it happens to all of these researchers. So the next point that you sent me was toxins. So tell me what's up with toxins.
So toxins are really interesting because, we have toxins in our body, as you know, right? We have arsenic in our soil, which is naturally found. Most minerals are toxins in high amounts. We just need them in the right dose, right? So toxins are just a buzzword. They're pretty meaningless coming from food, unless obviously you have food poisoning and that develops a toxin. That is something that's very dangerous. But most of the time they're not talking about food poisoning. They're talking about, I don't know what, all kinds of outside environmental toxins that may or may not have an effect on our bodies.
Or even nutrients as toxins.
Right. And, I find it interesting that people are so, obviously it's very scary, but do you know what's in your supplement? No, you don't know. The FDA is not regulating supplements. So that could be, your toxin right there. And I'm not scaring you away from those either. But how come that's not scary to you, that you don't know what's in your supplement? So.
Right. Well, and that goes back to, we have a lot of issues right now with influencers and how we as dietitians somehow are not as respected as someone who comes off possibly more polished on social media, even though they don't have the background that we do, because they're talking about all this stuff. And there seems to be a public questioning of anything that's official. And since the FDA doesn't look at supplements, they're not official, and therefore they must be safe. It's very counterintuitive.
Funny workaround, yeah.
It is.
But I do hear that a lot. Yes.
Yeah, that seems to be how it is. Okay, so once upon a time.
So that's a fun one for me, because we like to hark back into a generation when everything was good and right, and I don't quite understand that, because the average age, 2 generations ago even. The rate of death was age 50, because we died from infections around before the 1900s, before antibiotics. And now we have antibiotics. Would I want to live in that time? Not necessarily. So why are we harking back there? And I hear this a lot about plastics and things like that. And yes, we should be careful. We should, know what's in our food and our environment. There's no question. But once upon a time wasn't so great. So, but it does evoke a certain, feeling, and that's what they're going for. They're going for evoking a feeling. So again, this is a buzzword to kind of stay away from. Your grandma's time, once upon a time, when food was better and tasted better. I don't know. Is that true? We can find really good tasting food right now. So.
I've only been on this earth for a handful of decades, so I couldn't tell you if it's true.
And I've been longer, and I don't even know. So,
yeah, I love talking to people about this when it comes to, for instance, the Paleolithic diet, because it's the perfect diet, quote unquote, right? But the average lifespan of Paleolithic man was 36 years. So right. I'd already be dead. So I just can't.
And we did find when they did autopsies on bodies, they found that they did eat grains. So sorry.
Yeah. So then, sweeping generalizations. I love this one because so many of these headlines, I mean, the headlines just have this problem, the sweeping generalizations. We don't know if a small study that was performed on rats in Singapore could be generalized to the adult human population in the United States. We don't know that. And I don't know, I see this problem a lot.
Right, I lost from you.
Oh yeah, it's
right, because it's easy. Yeah.
Oh god.
It's easy. You don't have to prove anything. Oh, yeah, are you back?
Right. Yeah. Well,
so you don't have to really prove anything when you make a sweeping generalization. You can just say really almost anything. So again, something to stay away from. So what would be an example of that, Yaffi, of sweeping generalization that you've seen?
I've seen it more on a personal basis. For example, there was a woman I knew who said that she had a piece of fruit when she was pregnant and she didn't feel good afterwards. So that's when she learned that pregnant women shouldn't eat fruit. And I was like, well, maybe fruit was not the right thing for you to eat in that moment, but you can't take, I see that a lot where people take a personal experience and generalize it to everyone. Someone has lactose intolerance, so nobody should eat dairy. I just see that a lot on a more personal basis, less so in studies, just because of my own focus. But I'm sure you see that in studies as well.
Right, more anecdotal information, just from 1 or 2 people in your life. It doesn't mean it applies to you. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We do see that a lot. Like for instance, with the studies, if you have a small study in especially a different species, we can't generalize that to the human population without further research. And it's like the joke in the scientific community that every study seems to end with the conclusion, this needs to be followed up with more research. And
Right.
it's true, it does. It always does.
It does. And I think I sent you the link. There's a Twitter account that says just in mice. And I love following him because what he does is he looks at studies and then evaluates it and says, just in mice. So mice are not humans. It's a great start, but everything's it may not translate at all. And especially with cancer, it may not translate to humans. We have a much different metabolism and everything's on a larger scale, of course. So because it happens in a mice, it's a good start. It's a great beginning to the research, and we should definitely start there, but it may not translate. It may not be clinically significant. It may not be something that we can implement at all in our lifetime. So nothing to get yet excited about.
And you bring up a good point. Research is kind of like a game of chutes and ladders. Just because you start doesn't mean you finish. A lot of times you end up sliding down that slide to get back to the beginning, and you need to start over. And I was doing research for an article on the microbiome and how diabetes is affected by the population in the microbiome, the population of bacteria in your gut. And one of the studies was on zebrafish. I don't know how closely that relates to humans, but a complication on studying humans, especially my focus is pediatrics, especially studying babies and children, is that it can be very difficult to design a study that's ethical when you're dealing with a vulnerable population. Just like you said, with the study on childbirth, it's not like you can control, okay, this group is not going to have children at all, and that group has to have children. It's not ethical. And even going back to our the RDA and the daily values for micronutrients, it came from testing that would now be considered very unethical.
Absolutely.
And that's it.
Yeah. And fun fact, not fun fact, but a fact is that women were only included in studies in the past 25 years. And before that, it was not seen either as relevant, or there was a hesitancy to use women. So a lot of what we know, even about breast cancer, though there's been tremendous research, but about anything to do with women is only the past 25 years. That's a very short time. So we're really trying to play catch up with that and doing, a lot of research in that area. But that's an example of, like, if you look at heart disease, what we know about heart disease in women is very recent, that the symptoms are different. And in fact, that is the highest cause of death in women is heart disease. It's not cancer. And so that's only the last 25 years that we've been studying heart disease in women. So it's a real issue.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So if someone wants to go past the sensational headlines and look for themselves at the actual study, what we want to look at are a few things. We want to look at sample size. How many people or zebrafish or rats were involved in the study? What is the population? Who is it made out of? Is there bias? Is it sponsored by someone who's got an interest in a specific finding? Correlation and causality. Does the study prove a correlation, meaning these two things rise and fall at a similar time, or does it prove that one actually causes the other? And then the actual design of the study. There's a lot to consider.
There really is, and this is why a lot of people don't read studies. And most people start learning in depth about studies in graduate school. We don't even expect people in undergrad to start learning about studies. So it's a skill that you can learn. Everybody can learn, but it's a skill that you have to develop with education, with time. So, and I would add to that, even these are great examples, is something called confounding factors.
Oh, definitely.
Right? So, for example, there was a study on stomach cancer that there were higher rates among a certain population, but they didn't adjust for smoking, and smoking is a confounding factor, right? So I would just kind of say that study really isn't worth it, because there were smokers in the study, which causes most cancers. So, I don't know if it's directly related to stomach, but it will definitely be a confounding factor. So that's something to look at as well.
I saw some research on vitamin D, and I believe it was a while ago. I believe it was on autistic population, and I have trouble with some of these studies on autistic populations anyway. but um, it was a very small, I think it was 6 kids, and they weren't controlling for the rest of their nutrition, but they were looking at vitamin D intake, and they were isolating it to supplementation. But when we don't look at the overall nutrition intake, we don't know the amount that they're actually getting. And especially with vitamin D, you'd have to look at how much time they're spending in the sun. Where do they live? How covered are they? Are they using sunscreen? And all of these can get in the way of a valid conclusion or even a valid discussion.
Right. And it's not to say that if you have a small population, the study is flawed. We've had some good data from that. The study design is you'd have to ask a researcher, but that's just, if not more important than the actual population. Obviously, you want to look at population bias and things like that. But the design is going to be your first way. And in fact, when I look at a study, I tend to look at the methods first. So obviously the population, but what methods did they use? What was there a control group? And what did they do in both groups? So I look there first, and I know a lot of people look at the abstract and the conclusion, and you're going to look at that eventually. But the methods puts it in context for me. Is it, what did they, and then I look at really, what did they study?
And of course, the ideal is the double-blind placebo control group. You have a lot going on where the scientists don't know who's taken what, and the participants don't know who's done what, and that way they can come at it from a fresh perspective.
Right, and that bias. They're very expensive to do those studies. So
and they're not always reasonable.
Right, so it's a really hard study, and and I'm not knocking studies here. They're very, very important. So this is more about looking at headlines and rather than saying studies aren't good. This is at in content, right, in context. And there's so much valuable work going on, especially in the nutrition field. And when I ask people, are you confused about nutrition or about what to eat? And they're like, yes, because nutrition is a science, right? We know it's constantly evolving. But when you look at headlines, you don't think of it as a science. You think of it as like, they don't know what they're doing. Why are they telling me I can eat eggs now? And they told me I couldn't eat eggs before. So things are evolving, and as a result of research, which is a good thing.
Yes. Yeah. And we should always be staying on top of the new research, because sometimes things are reclassified. I mentioned that I have trouble with studies on the autistic population, and that's because there are so many subtypes of autism that you can't, when you study on children who are autistic, it just encompasses so many different types of situations and so many different dynamics that it's difficult for me to look at a conclusion from a study that didn't account for those different subtypes and take value from that conclusion. But as time goes on and we make official classifications for different subtypes of autism, that research can come back and we can explain it from a different angle and then repeat it in a more accurate way, a more meaningful way.
Right. Replication is key, whether you can repeat the study and see those results. Right.
Right. So we have another slide here, questions to ask. So when you're looking at a study, you need to ask questions of the study and how you're looking at it. And so the top one, is it peer reviewed? And you mentioned before, if other people are arguing against the results of that study, and we should listen to that. We should pay attention to it.
Right, because it's not just peer reviewed, but is it published in a peer reviewed journal? So it could be, seen by other experts and refuted, but if it hasn't been published in a peer-reviewed journal, I'd be very skeptical of the whole study and the results. So peer-reviewed lends an extra layer of, it's a jury of their peers. They're looking at it, whether it's relevant, whether it's significant, how are the methods, and it's a very important process.
Okay, so of the following, which is not a peer-reviewed publication? And I know this is a big stumper, okay? So the Journal of American Medical Association, or Shape Magazine.
This is a tough one.
I know, and I'm blanking on a third. So just choose between those. Which of those is a peer-reviewed publication?
So you're safe with JAMA. You're safe because it's, it's a peer-reviewed journal, and Shape magazine, it's fun, but it's not peer-reviewed. They probably have very good editors. I'm not knocking them, but they're not being reviewed as closely as something that is in a professional journal.
And they do choose some good authors. I know Toby Amador writes for them, and she's a dietitian. She's fantastic, and what she's writing isn't peer reviewed, but what she's reporting on is peer reviewed because she's who she is and she knows to be responsible. So it's not that there isn't value in these magazines. It's just that when you look at newspapers and you look at magazines, they're not peer reviewed publications, and so you do have to ask those questions. So the next one, has it been replicated? And I think we've covered that in the conversation. Yeah, and we like that game of chutes and ladders. You start at the beginning, we replicate a study on a bigger scale once it's been recognized as significantly important, and you get increased funding. Did it last long enough?
Yeah, I love that one, because especially, as you know, when it comes to weight loss. So if you study weight loss for 30 days and a person lost a certain amount of weight, and then they, that's seen as a success. Well, I want you to find that person after 90% chance that they gain that back. So that's a very important statistic to now factor in. So I especially see that.
And if you find them, I think if you find that same person at 5 years, that goes up to 95% chance that they've gained the weight back. And certain studies have indicated that they wouldn't gain the weight back, they gain more than the weight back.
Right, exactly right. So
yeah. Okay, so was it large enough? Well, we talked about that. You start with small and then you go bigger. So the smaller studies do have some value.
Yeah, and the last one, statistically meaningful. So we do want to look at that when we are looking at cause and effect. So I see this a lot in cancer research. When we say that if you're at a higher weight, you may get cancer, that's not cause and effect. We haven't proven that in any way yet. We've seen associations. It may or may not be relevant. So very important to look at whether that was proven or not in the study, and in many studies, not just one, right?
Right. Okay, so this one I like, and we'll talk about the implications. So the p-value, and I had thought before coming into this conversation, this was a reliable thing to look at, that when you're looking at a study, you look for the p-value. A p-value greater than 0.05 should not be taken as evidence for anything. A number that's lower than 0.05 does show a statistical significance for what you're trying to prove. But the limitation is in the study design and the interpretation. And if a study results in a conclusion that isn't proving what they set out to prove, it's possible that the data could be cherry-picked in order to show a significant result. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, I think you hit on it, but the p-value is what determines that something happened, not as random, not as chance, but really we can see maybe cause and effect from that. But it's very hard to achieve. We have to what's called reject the null. So we start with a question that's a negative. This did not happen as a result. I mean, you can give me an example of a null value. We have to reject that, not just prove that it's that the other is true. It's really, really hard to do. So it takes a really good study that, and there are cases where that's been other parts of data are highlighted, so it's hard to tell. So I'm not an expert on p-values. But there's room for misinterpretation there as well.
Okay, so it's something that we can look at with maybe a hesitant eye.
Right, and you know what? That's exactly what I would say about looking at studies. I always start with a healthy dose of skepticism. Is it really? Is it true? Is it relevant? Does it mean anything to public health yet? Like Mammograms. We know that mammograms, they don't prevent breast cancer, but they dramatically reduce the rates. And obviously they're our best diagnostic tool right now. So that's incredibly relevant to public health. And we have to make it more accessible. Just personally, I'd like to see mobile mammograms in every neighborhood so it can reach everybody. So that's an example of something that has been proven is clinically relevant and is implemented as a public health measure. So.
Right. So that's meaningful not only in the research, but directly to public health. And it's important to note that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So to conclude and discuss the results of our 2-person study on the skepticism of studies, if someone sees a sensational headline and says, I want to go back and look at the research, they want to go to a peer-reviewed source, which, and you can go onto Google Scholar. A lot of people don't know this. There's PubMed and there's also Google Scholar, and you can look up research there and put limitations. I don't want to see a study done on 6 people from 1975. Okay, you can put those filters, and that's a great way to look at some research. But once they have the research in front of them, where should they go from there?
Well, read it in depth, but you know what, obviously read it with skepticism, but even more so, I would say, were there policy changes as a result of that study yet? And if there weren't, then, why change anything yet? Because in your own life, it's not relevant yet. And I know people are obviously have a lot to say about policies, health policies in our country. But if there was a policy change like mammograms or whatever to do with dietary guidelines, yeah, maybe it's something that's important to you and you can incorporate into your life. So I would look at the relevance in terms of policy changes. And it takes years to do a policy change. It takes a lot of research. So, as you know, we like to say in dietetics, you don't change anything based on one study. You don't change the way you eat. Even if it's a terrific study, you don't change it yet because we don't know yet long term. We don't know if it's going to have relevance to most of the population. There has been policy changes. This year, we've made some policy changes on sodium and on vitamin D and things like that, which are relevant. And that's something to look at. So,
yeah. Yeah, and those are great points because we've been looking at vitamin D for a long time. And as I mentioned earlier, it's difficult to get valid research for these things because of ethics and study design and all that. But we did have some significant changes this year, and those should be looked at by the public. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation on statistical analysis and sensational headlines.
I hope it wasn't as boring as most of the studies are to read, but
well, I found it fascinating. That's why I wanted to have you on. So if anyone wants to contact Tamar, you can find her on Instagram at Nutrition Nom Nom, and your website is also, oh no, I'm sorry, that's backwards. Nom Nom Nutrition.
No, Nutrition Nom Nom on Facebook. And on Instagram, It's Breast Cancer Nutritionist. I have a website also. You can just go by my name, Tamar Rothenberg. And I'm co-facilitating now a study for cancer survivors in LA, thanks to, we have some great sponsors, American Institute for Cancer Research, Living Plate. And I just want to give them a plug, Cancer Support Community of LA, where we're doing the study, and it's fantastic. I'm really excited to be part of it, to show how nutrition can play a role. So, and thank you for this opportunity. It's always fun to chat.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I always have to have people on who know what they're talking about, and well, you teach this and you're living it, so you're the right person.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm going to put links to where people can contact you under the comments. And so maybe you'll get some questions. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to leave it in the comments section, and we will be patrolling those, not trolling them, patrolling them. And if you're Phoenix local, come join me for Toddler Test Kitchen. Go on toddlertestkitchen.net for dates and registration. The next one coming up is next Saturday, which is going to be led by the wonderful Sarah Garone of A Love Letter to Food. And we have something super exciting going on. And I wish I could be there.
I know.
What's that?
What's the theme of that week? Are you
Okay,
having?
I'll give you the theme. I don't tell people the recipes ahead of time, but it's going to be Asian inspired. And it's
Ooh.
going to, it's getting really hot over here. It was 110 this weekend, and it's only going to get better from here. So it's going to be something pretty cool.
We've had, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. And that's why we live in Arizona. Aside from the heat, there are very few natural disasters going on here. Yeah, we have the monsoons, which are often glorified wind and some sand in the air. But yeah, we don't have earthquakes or tornadoes or hurricanes, any of that. So, so we have a very cool recipe to go with the hot weather, to complement the hot weather.
So much fun, and I love what you're doing too.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'm here every Tuesday at 1:15 for Nap Time Nutrition, and of course, this is a pre-record because my kids are on summer vacation and got to have time to enjoy the family, right?
I always wonder where you put them. It's so quiet.
That's my secret.
What are you feeding them?
Yeah, they're actually elsewhere at the moment. So this is my hangout time.
Very good.
So,
all right. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me, Tamar, and I'm sure we will continue the conversation offline. Thank you so much, everyone who has joined us to watch, and I will see you next week right here at Nap Time Nutrition.
Take care. Bye-bye.